The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical prayer as Hannah Clarke pushed through the staff entrance at Oak Creek Memorial at 5:58 in the morning. Rain hammered the parking lot behind her, the kind of Denver spring downpour that hit hard and left everything dripping. She didn't shake it from her hair. Didn't rush. The hospital was still mostly dark on the 4th floor, the kind of quiet that belonged to graveyard shift nurses finishing their notes and day shift staff not yet caffeinated enough to talk. She clocked in. Badge read RN, MedSurg, 8 years of employment, clean record, no flags. The photo showed a woman with steady eyes and a mouth that didn't quite smile. The break room smelled like burnt coffee and someone's microwaved salmon from yesterday. Hannah hung her jacket on the hook in her assigned locker, the same hook she'd used for 8 years. Her hands, rough, scarred across the knuckles and webbed between thumb and forefinger, moved with efficiency. She touched the inside of the jacket lining briefly, fingers brushing the edge of fabric no one else at Oak Creek knew existed. A faded patch, 75th Ranger Regiment, threads coming loose at one corner. She pressed it flat against the lining and closed the locker door without a sound. In the mirror above the sink, her face was composed. Her left leg favored slightly as she walked toward the MedSurg unit, old damage from 9 years ago that had healed as well as shrapnel wounds ever did, which was to say it healed, but it remembered. The morning briefing started at 6:15 with Supervisor Reeves reading census numbers and bed assignments. Hannah stood near the back, coffee in one hand, tablet with patient charts in the other. The day shift was understaffed as usual, 2 call-outs, 1 nurse on vacation, which meant everyone would be running hard by noon. Reeves was mid-sentence about a transfer arriving sometime that evening when Dr. Hargrove swept through the glass doors with his 4 residents trailing behind him like ducklings. He didn't acknowledge the nursing staff. Didn't need to. His presence made the air pressure change, the way a predator changes the temperature in a room just by walking in. Expensive watch, tailored coat despite the hospital dress code, the kind of surgeon who'd stopped seeing patients as people somewhere around his 3rd malpractice settlement. Hannah's expression didn't shift. She made a note on her tablet about Mrs. Patterson's 0800 blood draw, as if Hargrove wasn't there at all, as if she didn't feel the weight of his gaze slide across her and move on, dismissing, categorizing, filing away as irrelevant. That was how she'd survived 8 years at Oak Creek. Invisibility wasn't weakness. Invisibility was strategy. Morning round started at 6:40. Hannah pushed the med cart down the hallway, checking 4 lines and assessing the 3 patients in her assignment. Room for 12, post-op appendectomy, vital stable, pain controlled. Room for 14, CHF admission, shortness of breath improving on Lasix, diuresis on track. Room for 17, diabetic with a cellulitis infection she'd been watching for signs of systemic involvement. Hannah's hands moved with muscle memory that belonged in a field hospital, not a general medical surgical floor. She checked the cellulitis again, the redness had receded a 1/4 inch overnight. She made a note recommending the doctor consider for antibiotics if the trend reversed. No one asked her opinion. That was how it worked. Hargrove breezed through at 7, barely stopping at each bed, his resident scrambling to keep up with his assessments. When he reached room 417, Hannah was already there, vital signs complete, patient sitting up, eating breakfast. She presented the numbers, temperature, blood pressure, heart rate, oxygen saturation, in the flat professional tone she'd perfected. Hargrove glanced at the chart she'd already prepared. The cellulitis wound. The antibiotic response. He nodded once at his residents, already moving toward the next room, and said without looking at her, nurses who think they understand trauma surgery are the reason good physicians leave medicine. The words weren't loud. Didn't need to be. The hallway was quiet enough that everyone heard them, the other residents, the MedSurg nurses at the station, the patient in 417 who suddenly became very interested in his eggs. Hannah didn't respond. Didn't let the words land on her face, didn't let them move through her. She was used to this. 8 years of being a competent, invisible woman in a hospital run by men who saw her competence as presumption. She'd learned to absorb words the way body armor absorbs impact, the sound of them registered, but the damage never made it through. Her hands continued moving, checking me foresight with the precision of someone who'd done this work long enough that her body could run on autopilot while her mind stayed elsewhere. The patient in 417 watched her with something that might have been gratitude. She didn't acknowledge it. Acknowledgement was dangerous. By mid-morning, the floor was chaos in the controlled way that hospitals ran. A patient in 411 needed a Foley catheter replaced. 2 admissions came through from the ER. Someone's family was demanding to speak to a manager. Hannah moved through it all with the kind of calm that came from having already survived the worst. Her body remembered things her employment file would never record. Her hands remembered. Her reflexes remembered. When the code alarm didn't sound on 4 West, she heard it from 3 floors away, that specific tone that meant someone's heart had stopped somewhere in the hospital, and she was moving before the overhead page could announce which unit. She didn't hesitate. Didn't check in with the supervisor. She'd trained too long, learned too well, lived through too much to ignore that sound. The crash cart was already rolling when she hit the stairwell. 4th floor to 3rd floor, muscle memory in her legs despite the limp, and by the time she pushed through the doors to 4 West, the resident was already frozen over a 72-year-old man whose rhythm had flatlined into asystole. Hannah was gloved and moving before anyone could tell her she was outside her scope. She positioned the crash cart. Checked the monitor. Called out the rhythm. Asystole. 2 minutes down. Epinephrine is ready. Her voice had dropped an octave, the way it did in emergencies, the way it had sounded in Sangin when the decisions had to be made in 3 seconds or people died. The resident looked at her, uncertain, and she said, "Start compressions. Now." It wasn't a request. It was the voice of someone who'd spent 16 years making people move in the dark. The resident started compressions. The code lasted 8 minutes. The patient's rhythm came back during the 3rd round of epinephrine, a sinus rhythm that held, that climbed from 40 beats to 60 to 80, each beep of the monitor a small promise that he might survive this. The cardiologist arrived, took over, and Hannah stepped back with her hand still gloved, her breathing still steady, her face still composed. She'd learned composure in places where showing stress got people killed. 1 code in a hospital was nothing. Just Tuesday. But that wasn't the worst part. Hargrove had been standing in the doorway the entire time. Watching her move through the code with hands that didn't tremble, with a presence that made the resident step aside without question, with the kind of authority that came from somewhere much deeper than a 2-year nursing degree. When Hannah stepped back and began documenting on the chart, she felt his eyes on her like weight. Felt him calculating something behind those expensive glasses. She didn't look up. Didn't acknowledge it. Just kept her expression neutral and her handwriting precise, noting the time of arrest, the interventions, the recovery of spontaneous circulation at 08 for 2 hours. By lunchtime, news had come down from upstairs about the transfer arriving that evening. An Army Ranger captain named Marcus Reeves. Multiple trauma facilities had already refused his case, shrapnel wound, hemorrhage, complexity that pushed into the grey zone where surgery might save him or might just damage him further and then he'd die anyway. High liability. High risk. The kind of patient that made administrators nervous and lawyers start working overtime. Hannah heard the news in the hallway outside the cafeteria and her hands paused for exactly half a second. Just enough for her body to register that her own life was about to become significantly more complicated. She continued walking. Got a salad. Sat by the window overlooking the parking lot where rain was still falling. Her left leg ached slightly from the code, the old wound remembering stress the way some people's joints remembered rain. She thought about the faded patch in her locker. About the voice that came out of her when codes went bad. About how she'd spent 8 years working as hard as she could to be invisible, and how sometimes the worst thing that could happen was being seen. The afternoon shift came and went. Hannah finished her charting, updated all her assessments, prepared the units for whatever the evening would bring. At 4 o'clock, she clocked out early, changed into clean scrubs, and clocked back in for the evening shift. No one questioned it. She'd done this before, double shifts, triple shifts, whatever it took. Supervisor Reeves just nodded and handed her the intake forms for the incoming transfer. Trauma case. Complex. Unstable. The transfer arriving at 7 p.m. from Regional Medical. Hannah took the forms and walked to the medical records room, where the afternoon light was turning gold and the room was quiet. She pulled up Marcus Reeves's chart on the system. Read through the notes from every facility that had refused him. The shrapnel pattern suggested vascular involvement. The hemorrhage suggested active bleeding somewhere they couldn't quite locate. The complexity suggested surgery, which might work, which might fail, which might leave him paralyzed or brain damaged or just dead on the table. She looked at his service record, included in the transfer notes. Army Ranger, Captain rank, 3rd Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment. She looked at his date of birth, 34 years old. She looked at his next of kin, mother and sister, both listed in Denver, both probably already in the waiting room. And she began to calculate, with the kind of precision that belonged in a battlefield, what his chances actually were. The emergency conference room at Oak Creek Memorial filled at 1900 hours like a courtroom convening for sentencing. 12 physicians, surgery, trauma, vascular, critical care, orthopedics, anesthesia, filed in with the weight of institutional authority pressing their shoulders down. Dr. Hargrove stood at the head of the table, Captain Marcus Reeves' CT scans already projected on the wall behind him, glowing like evidence in a prosecution. Hannah stood in the back corner, her hands folded, her badge catching the fluorescent glare. Nobody had asked her to be there. She'd simply appeared, the way nurses do, present but not acknowledged, necessary but invisible. Hargrove's voice cut through the room like a surgeon's scalpel. Gentlemen, what you're looking at is a catastrophic trauma case. Shrapnel penetration near the subclavian artery. Hemorrhagic shock. 2 previous surgical attempts at Landstuhl failed. Both failed. He let that word hang. Failed. The question before us is not whether we can save this patient. The question is whether we should attempt to save him. The vascular surgeon leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. Liability nightmare. If he codes on the table, and he will code on the table, this hospital is looking at millions in malpractice exposure. Not to mention our credentialing, added the trauma chief, a woman whose reputation for excellence had somehow calcified into an allergy to risk. If word gets out that Oak Creek authorized a procedure with survival probability below 15%, every insurance carrier in Colorado will be asking questions. One by one, they spoke. The anesthesiologist worried about the difficulty of intubation with the wound anatomy. The orthopedic surgeon mentioned he had a 0600 case the next morning and couldn't be tied up in an extended procedure. The critical care physician simply shook his head. Not our patient. Not our problem. Hargrove nodded, as if conducting an orchestra playing exactly the notes he'd written. We are physicians, not miracle workers. This institution will not authorize a procedure with less than 15% survival probability. We have a duty to this hospital. To our other patients. To ourselves. The decision fell like a gavel. 12 voices. 12 refusals. 12 men and women who'd taken an oath to preserve life, now voting collectively to preserve their own careers instead. Hannah's voice cut through the silence like a blade finding bone. He's 26 years old. The room froze. All 12 heads turned. Dr. Hargrove's eyes narrowed, and when he smiled, it was the smile of a man who'd been waiting for exactly this moment. I'm sorry, Nurse Clarke, did the hospital grant you admitting privileges I'm unaware of? His voice dripped with theatrical concern. A medical degree hiding somewhere in that badge. Scattered chuckles rippled through the conference room, the sound of power protecting itself, of hierarchy reinforcing its own boundaries. Hargrove stood, closing the file with deliberate slowness. He began walking toward her, his movements carrying the weight of institutional authority. Does anyone else smell that? He asked the room, his voice pitched for an audience. That distinct scent of overreach? Of a nurse who watched too much Grey's Anatomy and thinks she understands surgical decision-making. The laughter swelled. Hargrove was performing now, and the room was his stage. "Nurse Clarke, you've been here 8 years, correct? 8 years in a support role. And yet you believe you possess the judgment to contradict 12 board-certified physicians." Hannah took one measured breath. Her jaw tightened, not from fear, but from the weight of restraint. From muscle memory developed in places where men screamed and decisions were measured in seconds, and the difference between a right call and a wrong call was the difference between going home or being zipped into a body bag. She did not flinch. She did not argue. She simply held his gaze with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived worse. "You are out of line," Hargrove said quietly, just for her now. Completely out of line. The 12 doctors filed out in a cluster, their decision made, their institutional protection secured. The CT scans continued glowing on the wall, Marcus Reeves' anatomy rendered in shades of grey, his life reduced to a liability calculation. 2 hours later, Hannah sat in the ICU with Marcus's mother and sister, both of them trembling, both of them clutching phones and prayer apps and the frail hope that somehow, something could be done. Hannah's voice was quiet, professional, the voice of someone delivering news that tasted like ash. "The hospital is exploring transfer options. There may be facilities in the Denver metro that..." The ICU doors swung open without warning. Dr. Hargrove entered in surgical scrubs, his presence commanding the room the way a storm commands a sky. He didn't acknowledge Hannah. He moved directly to Marcus's mother, positioning himself between the bed and the chair with the precision of a man who understood spatial dominance. "Mrs. Reeves, I want to be very clear about something." His voice carried the warmth of false compassion. "Your son's condition is being managed by the most qualified physicians in this region. Unfortunately, there's a systemic problem in hospitals like ours. Overreaching nurses who can't accept their place. They advocate beyond their competence. They question decisions they lack the training to understand. They give families false hope." He paused, letting that phrase settle. False hope. That's why good physicians are leaving medicine. Marcus's sister gripped her mother's hand. His mother's eyes filled with tears. "Nurse Clarke, step into the hallway." It wasn't a request. It was a command delivered in the voice of a man accustomed to unquestioned obedience. The hallway smelled like antiseptic and dying flowers from the gift shop arrangements wilting in patient rooms. Hannah followed him out, her hand steady, her breathing even. Behind them, Marcus Reeves lay sedated, his monitors beeping their mechanical rhythm, his life suspended between medical possibility and institutional refusal. Hargrove turned to face her, and his voice dropped to the register of absolute authority. "You are a nurse. You take orders. You do not question surgical boards. You do not contradict physician judgment in front of patients' families. You certainly do not advocate for procedures that every qualified physician in this hospital has deemed contraindicated." His voice hardened. "This is your final warning. Do you understand me?" Hannah looked at him, really looked at him, and saw a man whose power depended entirely on the architecture of hierarchy, on the assumption that everyone below him would remain below him, would accept their place, would remember that respect flowed only downward in institutions like this one. She reached up with her right hand and wiped a single tear from her cheek without breaking eye contact. The tear fell. She did not follow it. Her eyes remained locked on his. "I've seen 12 men make the same calculation you just did," she said, her voice steady and low. "Every one of them died wondering if they'd chosen wrong." The hallway went so quiet you could hear the ventilators humming behind closed doors, the distant ping of an elevator arriving, the small sounds of a hospital that continued operating regardless of the conversations that determined who lived and who died. Hargrove's face reddened like a sunrise spreading across a battlefield. His jaw worked, searching for words that would restore the hierarchy she'd cracked with a single sentence. "That's it. That's insubordination. Write yourself up. Today. I want a full self-report in my office by end of shift, or I'll write it myself." Hannah turned and walked back into the ICU room without responding. She checked Marcus's full lines. She adjusted his blanket. She made a note in his chart. Marcus's mother watched her with an expression that mixed gratitude and confusion, as if she'd just witnessed something she didn't have language for. The next morning, a formal disciplinary notice appeared on the staff bulletin board in the nurses' station, printed on official hospital letterhead, sealed with institutional authority. Incident report, a nurse disciplinary action. Name, Hannah Clarke, RN. Date, previous day. Violation, inappropriate advocacy, insubordination, undermining physician authority. Disposition, written warning. Notation, subject nurse exceeded scope of practice, questioned physician decision-making in presence of patient family, and demonstrated inappropriate challenge to hospital protocol. Hannah read it once. Her face remained neutral. Her hands didn't shake. But the message it contained was designed to spread, to infect, to poison the well of professional respect. The break room at noon became a study in institutional silence. 7 nurses sat scattered around the table, nurses Hannah had worked alongside for years, nurses who'd called her Hannah in the elevator, who'd borrowed her protein bars and complained about the night shift and sat with her through other people's crises. All 7 of them. Hannah entered with her lunch. She pulled out a chair. She opened her container. One by one, they stood. One nurse collected her Tupperware. Another gathered her phone and her water bottle. A third folded her napkin with deliberate care. Nobody spoke. Nobody made eye contact. They simply relocated, a coordinated, wordless exodus to the hallway where conversations resumed as if Hannah had never existed at all. She sat alone at the table, chewing a sandwich that tasted like cardboard and institutional abandonment. Through the small window in the break room door, she could see them gathered in the hallway, their voices carrying just enough to be heard but not loud enough to include her. The message was clear: association with Hannah Clarke was now a liability. The hospital had spoken. Hargrove had spoken. And the machinery of institutional punishment had begun its slow, efficient work of isolation. Hannah finished her sandwich. She threw the container away. She washed her hands and returned to the ICU where Marcus Reeves lay unconscious, his life hanging by a thread, his family hoping for something the 12 most qualified physicians in Colorado had decided was too dangerous to attempt. She had no idea what was about to happen at 0340 hours. The alarm screamed at 0340 hours. 3 short bursts that meant one thing: the patient who shouldn't have lived through the night wasn't living anymore. Hannah was already moving before the second burst finished, muscle memory that belonged to a body that had answered emergency calls on 3 continents, in languages she no longer spoke, for people whose names she would never know. Her boots hit the tile in that particular rhythm: 1, 2, 3, 4. The ICU corridor was empty except for the night nurse calling for backup, voice high and thin like stretched wire. Marcus Reeves lay in Bay 7, his monitors a symphony of failure. Oxygen saturation 71 and dropping. Heart rate climbing past 140. His body was seizing, back arched, muscles locked in the convulsion that meant his nervous system had stopped negotiating with his brain and started screaming. But that wasn't the real problem. The real problem was his neck. His trachea had shifted visibly to the left, a deviation so pronounced you could see it beneath the skin like a rope being pulled taut by someone standing under the bed. Tension pneumothorax. His left lung had collapsed and was pressurizing the space between his ribs, crushing his heart, collapsing the vessels that fed it blood. He had minutes. Maybe less. Dr. Feldman stood at the foot of the bed, frozen in the posture of someone trying to calculate the liability in real time. His hands hung at his sides like he'd borrowed them and forgotten how to use them. He'd been the attending since 9 p.m., the one who'd walked into that emergency conference room this morning with 11 other physicians, the one who'd looked at Marcus Reeves' chart and calculated that the suit he'd lose was worth more than the life he wouldn't try to save. Now he was watching that calculation burn itself out in the space between his neurons and his conscience. Hannah didn't stop to ask permission. The attending was frozen. The resident wasn't in the room. The nurse manager was 2 floors away, checking paperwork, completely unaware that the case everyone had decided was too dangerous was about to be saved or lost in the next 40 seconds. She moved to the bedside with her hands already steady, already knowing where everything was: the crash cart, the airway equipment, the needle kit. Her fingers found the supplies the way a pianist finds the keys in the dark. 14-gauge angiocath needle. That was what she needed. That and about half a second's worth of certainty that she wouldn't miss. She swabbed the chest with betadine. The antiseptic smell rose up sharp and chemical, cutting through the fierce sweat in the room. The second intercostal space, midclavicular line. That's where the air was trapped. That's where the pressure was building like a fist inside his chest, squeezing his heart, suffocating him from the inside out. She'd done this once before, in a compound outside Sangin with a 19-year-old Marine whose name she couldn't say and equipment made of things God never intended to be inside a human body. She'd done it and he'd lived for 3 more weeks until the infection got him. She'd done it and sworn she'd never need to do it again because she'd retired from being the person who knew how to save people in the 60 seconds that separated the breathing from the knot. But her hands remembered. The needle went in at 45 degrees, sliding through skin that was damp and cold, through the intercostal muscles, through the pleura, and into the space where death was building pressure like a bomb counting down. The hiss, that particular hiss of air under pressure decompressing back into atmosphere, filled the room like a sigh. The sound of trauma deflating. The sound of physics deciding someone deserved to live. O2 sat climbed. 75. 82. 90. The numbers climbed like prayer, like redemption, like the universe briefly remembering which side it was supposed to be on. The monitors stopped their screaming and switched over to something resembling concern instead of certainty. Heart rate came down from the 140s into the 130s, then the 120s. The seizure stopped. Marcus's body went slack, his back releasing from that terrible arch, and his lungs, his actual lungs, began moving air again in the controlled mechanical rhythm the ventilator was giving him. 40 seconds. That's all it took. Dr. Feldman stood watching like he was observing an entirely different universe than the one he'd been standing in before. The attending who'd refused to touch this case just watched a nurse perform an emergency decompression that had no business succeeding, that had no business being attempted by a person with an RN badge instead of an MD after her name. The silence in the room lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then the telemetry alarm quieted. Then normal breathing sounds returned through the endotracheal tube. Then the only sound was the ventilator's steady mechanical whisper and the baseline hum of all the machines designed to keep people alive when nature had decided they shouldn't be. Hannah didn't look at Feldman. Didn't look at her hands, which weren't shaking. Didn't take a victory breath or close her eyes in relief. She did what any competent medical professional would do after emergency intervention: she documented. O2 sat pre-intervention, 71%. Post-intervention, 93% within 40 seconds. Procedure, needle decompression at second intercostal space, midclavicular line. Complications, none observed. Patient response, positive. She wrote it down in the chart with the handwriting of someone filing an incident report about a routine medication administration, not about an emergency procedure that existed in a category of illegality depending on which way a hospital administrator decided to interpret the boundaries of a nursing license. By the time Dr. Feldman found his voice, Hannah was already moving. She was preparing medications, checking lines, assessing the patient's response to the intervention with the precision of someone who'd learned to triage in conditions where hospitals were things you described in past tense. The attending began backing away. Then he left the room entirely. She never saw him speak to anyone about what he'd witnessed. Some people, she understood, went through their entire lives without testing whether they were cowards. It was easier that way. Safer. Less complicated. What happened next didn't start in the ICU. It started for hours later in a corner office on the administrative floor where Dr. Hargrove sat across from the chief of staff and 2 attorneys whose billable hours started the moment they walked through the door. The office smelled like expensive leather and the particular kind of air conditioning that only happened in rooms with 6-figure yearly maintenance contracts. Hargrove had the patient chart open, the one with Hannah's intervention documented in her own handwriting like she'd confessed to a crime scene, and he was holding it like it was evidence. Which, to him, it was. She performed an invasive procedure without physician supervision, Hargrove said, voice steady and certain, the voice of a man who'd already won this argument in his own head before anyone else was awake. Without consent. Without authorization. This is exactly the kind of cowboy mentality that destroys institutions. That bankrupts hospitals. That costs lives. He slid the chart across the polished desktop like it was a playing card, and this was a game whose rules he'd written. I'm filing a formal report with the Colorado Medical Board for practicing beyond scope of practice. Today. One of the attorneys nodded. The other one was already taking notes. We'll need everything documented, the first one said. To protect the hospital from liability in either direction. Already handled, Hargrove said. He held up his phone. 3 calls. First, the board chairman. Owed me a favor from 6 months ago when I kept his son's DUI out of the hospital system. Now I'm calling that marker. He dialed. The phone rang twice. When the chairman answered, Hargrove's voice became something different, respectful, reasonable, urgent. I need Hannah Clarke's employment terminated. I need her personnel file flagged. I need it done today before word gets out that we had a staff member practicing medicine without a license on a high-profile trauma case. The liability exposure is catastrophic. Pause. Then, I'll email you the documentation within the hour. He hung up. His fingers were already moving to the second number. Colorado Medical Board investigator, he said to the room. To no one. To himself. The call connected. His voice shifted again, official, concerned, the voice of a physician protecting standards and public safety. I'm reporting a critical incident involving a nurse, RN Hannah Clarke, who performed emergency thoracostomy without physician supervision. Yes, I have witnesses. The patient survived, but that's not the point, is it? We have standards for a reason. We have scope of practice for a reason. I'm concerned about the patient's long-term prognosis given the lack of proper protocols during the intervention. He listened for a moment. Yes, I understand you'll be contacting the hospital. Yes, I'll cooperate fully with the investigation. The second call ended. He didn't hesitate. The third call was already dialing before anyone else in the room had processed the first 2. Hannah's nursing school references. The professors who'd written letters of recommendation 10 years ago. The voices on the other end of those calls would be confused at first, then concerned, then convinced that there was something dangerous about someone who'd slipped beneath their institution's radar long enough to hurt people. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part happened at noon when Hannah came back from her forced break, the one the shift supervisor had given her with the apologetic eyes of someone who'd already heard about the needle decompression from at least 3 different sources, and found the termination letter on her locker. Not delivered to her. Posted where everyone would see it. Where the administrative team could demonstrate they'd acted swiftly. Where the hospital could show the board they'd taken immediate decisive action against a rogue employee. Effective immediately, your employment is suspended pending investigation by the Colorado Medical Board into allegations of practicing beyond the scope of a nursing license. You are to relinquish your badge and keys. Hospital security will escort you from the facility. The words were typed in Helvetica and signed by people she'd never met in rooms she'd never been invited to. Security arrived at 1,240 hours with a cardboard box. The kind they always used. The kind that had contained someone else's 15 years just 2 weeks ago when old Ted from orthopedics had his heart attack and his position was posted within 72 hours. They placed her personal items inside it, the photo of her platoon that she kept in her locker, the water bottle someone had given her at a retirement ceremony she was supposed to attend in 2003, the extra stethoscope she'd bought herself with money she'd earned. They didn't place the faded unit patch inside the box. The patch that was sewn into the lining of her jacket. The one that had survived 9 years of lying low, 9 years of being someone else, 9 years of existing in the margins of a life that wasn't supposed to remember her. That one stayed with her. Everything else, her credential, her authority, her name on the staff roster, her access to the one place where she'd managed to be both invisible and useful, went into the box. The guard was polite. The guard was actually kind. He'd worked there for 14 years and he knew what this looked like, which was a hospital protecting itself. Which was an institution deciding that the appearance of compliance was worth more than the reality of what had happened in Bay 7 at 03 for 5 hours. He didn't say any of this. He just carried the box. Hannah carried nothing. Her hands were empty. Her face was empty. Her voice, when she spoke to no one in particular as they walked past the nursing station, was empty too. "I'm going on break," she said to the air. One of the newer nurses almost laughed before realizing it wasn't actually funny. The rain started exactly as she stepped into the parking lot. Not gentle rain. Rain that came down like accusations, like the sky had decided to make a statement about things that happened when people did the right thing and the system decided that was too expensive to allow. Hannah didn't run. Didn't rush. Didn't shake water from her hair or quicken her pace or show any sign that the weather was anything except a fact she'd already accepted the moment she'd pushed that needle into Marcus Reeves' chest and decided that some things mattered more than a nursing license. Behind her, in a corner office on the administrative floor, Dr. Hargrove was making a fourth phone call, not an official one, not documented, not something that would appear in any record. This call was to a prosecutor who owed him money from a long-standing arrangement that involved both of them pretending certain things had never happened. "I need to know," Hargrove said into the phone, "if there's any possibility that our nurse here has a military background. Anything that might complicate the discipline." The prosecutor would call back within 2 hours with nothing. Because Hannah Clarke's records, if they existed, had been classified and sealed and buried so completely that even people looking for them wouldn't find anything except concrete walls and federal silence. Security's footsteps echoed through the corridor behind her, not rushing, just inevitable. The guard, the one with the 101st Airborne tattoo barely visible under his sleeve, carried her cardboard box like a pallbearer. Hannah walked ahead of him through the halls of Oak Creek Memorial, past the bulletin board where her disciplinary notice still hung next to the staff schedule, past the break room where 7 nurses had relocated their lunches without a word, past the code cart she'd restocked 3 times that shift before Dr. Hargrove made his calls. The administrator walked beside her, maintaining professional distance, the way someone walks beside someone they've just fired. "You understand the suspension is pending investigation," he said quietly. "The Colorado Medical Board will contact you within 10 business days." Hannah didn't respond. Her hands, scarred from 2 decades of holding other people's lives together, stayed at her sides. She didn't clench them. She didn't let anything show except forward motion. The ER doors slid open automatically, and the Denver afternoon hit her like a physical thing, dry heat, the smell of asphalt baking under August sun, the distant sound of a helicopter approaching from the north. She kept walking. The guard stayed 3 steps behind, giving her the dignity of not watching her leave. That small kindness nearly broke something in her chest, but she kept her breathing even. The parking lot was 300 feet of concrete between her and the person she used to be. A cardboard box. 3 scrub tops. A stethoscope that cost more than her phone. Her jacket with the faded 75th Ranger Regiment patch sewn into the inside lining, the one she'd cut from a uniform in a field hospital in Sangin when the boy wearing it was 6 years old and screaming. She didn't turn around as she walked. Didn't glance back at the building. Didn't do anything except load the box into her truck, start the engine, and drive until the hospital disappeared in the side mirror. 14 days later, Hannah sat in the Denver VA hospital waiting room at 0900 hours on a Wednesday morning. Not as a nurse. Not as a provider. As a patient. As someone broken enough to need help. The intake form asked about insomnia. She wrote, since 2004. The intake coordinator didn't ask for details. Just nodded and handed her a folder. Around her, the room hummed with the quiet weight of injury. A Marine with a service dog rested his head against the wall, the animal's breathing steady and deliberate. 2 women in VA baseball caps talked quietly about medication adjustments. An older man with a prosthetic leg read a newspaper from 3 days ago, not because he cared about the news but because his hands needed something to do. A ranger in a 75th Regiment shirt sat across from her, his jaw clenched so tight she could see the muscle flexing. Hannah had treated wounds like theirs in field hospitals where the screaming never stopped and the blood kept coming, and you made calculations about who you could save based on velocity and vessel size and how much time you had before the next round came in. She had held intestines back into abdominal cavities. She had tied off arteries with shaking hands that had somehow learned not to shake. She had whispered lies to dying soldiers: "You're going to be fine, we're getting you out, your family's waiting," because sometimes a lie was the only anesthetic that worked. She didn't recognize any of them. They didn't recognize her. She was just another vet seeking treatment for something that couldn't be fixed with surgery or antibiotics or time. Just another ghost in hospital waiting rooms across the country. The receptionist called her name, her real name, the one that was supposed to be dead, and Hannah stood. The ranger looked up briefly, the way soldiers do, scanning for threat or familiarity or some sign of kinship. She kept her gaze straight ahead and walked into the clinical corridor, where fluorescent lights hummed like sick fluorescent things and the smell of antiseptic and aging carpet made her stomach clench. She made it through intake. Made it through the initial evaluation. Made it as far as the parking lot before she sat in her truck and pressed her forehead against the steering wheel and let the weight of 2 weeks settle into her bones. The phone in her pocket buzzed. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. Almost let it ring through to voicemail. But the area code was 303, and something in her training made her pick up. Ms. Clarke. A woman's voice, professional, careful. "This is Jennifer Reeves, Marcus Reeves's mother. I need to talk to you about something. A folder. My congressman's office helped me get access to. I don't know what exactly, but there's a military liaison who wants to speak with you. At the hospital. Today if possible. At my son's room. He's conscious now. He's been asking for you." Hannah's chest went very still. "There's a restraining order," she said quietly. "I know. I'm having my attorney contact the court. You saved my son's life. Everyone's finally starting to understand that. Can you come? Around 2,200 hours, when the shift change happens. There will be people here who need to tell you something." Hannah hung up without committing. But she sat in her truck in the VA parking lot and let the realization settle into her: Marcus Reeves had survived. The outside surgical team had actually saved him. The needle decompression had bought him enough time. She drove back to her apartment, a 2-room place off Colfax Avenue where nobody asked questions and the landlord didn't care when the rent came in cash. She showered away the smell of insomnia clinic and institutional carpet. She changed into civilian clothes. She waited until 21:45 hours, then drove back to Oak Creek Memorial. The visitor parking was separate from the employee parking now. A different entrance. A different world. She wore a baseball cap pulled low and took a visitor badge from the unmanned station, just another person with a personal reason to be inside these walls at night. Marcus's room was on 4 West. The elevator doors opened soundlessly, and the hallway was exactly as she remembered it, the dim quiet of nighttime in a hospital, when most of the staff was charting and the machines did their work without witnesses. She found his room number, pressed her hand against the door frame for one measured breath, and stepped inside. Marcus lay in the hospital bed with the kind of stillness that only comes from heavy sedation or deep sleep. His left leg was elevated, the surgical site wrapped and monitored. And 4 stand held 3 bags. The ventilator hummed beside him, though she could see from the monitors that he was breathing over the machine, his body doing the work now, the equipment just there in case. His mother dozed in the corner chair, her head tilted at an angle that would hurt her neck, her hand still clutching the folder. Hannah stepped to the bedside. She was going to leave, slip back out, send a message that she'd come and gone. But Marcus's eyes opened. Not slowly. Fully. His pupils dilated, focusing, tracking, processing. His eyes moved across her face like a scanner, cheekbones, scars, the thin line of her mouth, and then they went very wide. His right hand lifted from the mattress. It trembled like a man with Parkinson's, or like a man who hadn't moved that arm in 4 days and his nervous system was relearning the geometry. His mouth formed words around the endotracheal tube still in his throat. No sound came out, but Hannah read the shape his lips made with the clarity of someone who'd spent 20 years understanding what people meant when they couldn't say it aloud. Reaper 6. Mrs. Reeves jerked awake at the motion. She saw Hannah. She saw her son's reaction, the way his heart rate jumped on the monitor from 68 to 102, not distress, not fear. Recognition. The kind of recognition that predates this hospital, this injury, this version of life. "Who are you?" Mrs. Reeves whispered, but her voice carried something like understanding already forming. Before Hannah could speak, the door opened. Dr. Hargrove, flanked by security and a man in a suit who had hospital attorney written all over him. Hargrove smiled like someone who'd just caught the last piece of evidence he needed. "I knew you'd violate the restraining order," he said. His voice carried the satisfaction of someone who'd been waiting for exactly this moment. "That's criminal trespassing, Nurse Clarke. Call the police." Hannah stood. She didn't move fast. She didn't run. She walked toward the door with the kind of quiet dignity that comes from having already survived the worst possible thing, which means nothing that happens after carries the same weight. At the threshold, she turned back to Marcus. His eyes were fixed on her, reading her the way she'd read him. "You did good, Captain," she said. Her voice sounded different than it had in the hospital, deeper, older, stripped of the deference that had been a disguise. "You became exactly who your father knew you'd be." Marcus's eyes filled with tears, but his hand didn't fall. His breathing didn't change. The monitor kept its steady rhythm. Security escorts moved her toward the elevator, past the bulletin board now, past the staff stations where night shift nurses pretended not to notice. They handed her the cardboard box at the employee exit. 3 scrub tops. A stethoscope. Her jacket with the patch inside. The guard, the one with the 101st Airborne tattoo, hesitated before opening the exit door. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "my daughter's alive because of nurses like you." Hannah nodded once and walked into the night. But she didn't go home. She sat in her truck in the parking lot and waited, because she knew what came next. Military doesn't move this fast unless it's been planning to move for a while. The helicopter arrived at 2,247 hours. Marcus Reeves' eyes flutter open at 03 for 7 hours, and the first thing he sees is the ceiling tiles of the ICU. The second thing he sees is Hannah Clarke standing at the foot of his bed, still wearing her scrubs, still wearing the composure of someone who has already calculated 17 different ways this moment could go wrong. He doesn't ask how he survived. He doesn't ask about the surgery or the blood loss or the 12 physicians who walked away. He simply looks at her, and his voice comes out like gravel through a rusted gate, Reaper 6. The name hangs in the sterile air between them. 3 syllables. A call sign from a war that officially never happened, deployed by a soldier who was supposed to be dead, spoken to a nurse the hospital tried to erase. His mother gasps from the chair beside his bed where she's been keeping vigil for 18 hours. His sister's hand finds her shoulder. And Hannah doesn't move. She doesn't flinch. She doesn't acknowledge the weight of those 3 words the way a civilian would. She simply nods, once, and that's when Mrs. Reeves understands that her son is saying something more important than any of them realize. The documents arrive before dawn. A congressman's office doesn't move slowly when a decorated military family calls in favors, and Mrs. Reeves called hers at 0311 hours with her son's blood still drying on her clothes. She walks into Marcus's ICU room holding a manila folder stamped with the kind of official seals that make hospital attorneys nervous. Behind her, a SEAL commander in dress blue uniform stands with the bearing of someone who has held a rifle while standing on the graves of enemies. Behind him, an FBI liaison in a charcoal suit carries a second folder, thicker than the first. The room's air pressure changes. Mrs. Reeves' hands tremble as she opens the personnel file, and she reads the words aloud like they're a prayer that needs bearing witness. Senior Chief Petty Officer Hannah Clarke, Navy Special Warfare. She looks up at Hannah, and the recognition in her eyes is the kind that comes too late and cuts too deep. 18 years of service. 2 tours. 3 separate deployments to. She stops. The words on the next page are still classified enough that speaking them aloud would require different clearances. But the seal is there. The signature is there. The proof that everything the hospital believed about the quiet nurse in the ICU was a catastrophic miscalculation. The SEAL commander steps forward, and his voice has the texture of someone accustomed to being obeyed immediately. 2 Navy crosses. He pauses, letting that weight settle. For Bronze Stars with Valor. Another beat. The attorney representing Oak Creek Memorial's legal department goes pale. And she's the only medic to survive Operation Lightning Strike. He says it like he's reading a headstone. The silence that follows isn't empty. It's full of all the things that can't be said in a hospital room, but everyone understands: classified operations, body counts, decisions made at 0300 hours that echo across decades. The FBI liaison steps closer to the bed, and her tone shifts to something almost conversational, which somehow makes it more devastating. Her last mission saved 17 Afghan village elders from a Taliban assassination cell. Those 17 men now hold cabinet positions in the current government. She lets that sink in. When retaliation threats became credible, threats specific enough to require federal intervention, the Navy ordered her into witness protection. Officially, Senior Chief Petty Officer Hannah Clarke died in 2004. She looks directly at the hospital's attorney. She wasn't supposed to exist. She wasn't supposed to work at a civilian hospital. She wasn't supposed to be here. And yet, when your physicians calculated liability, she calculated blood loss and O2 saturation and the 40 seconds it takes to save a life that matters. Dr. Hargrove hasn't entered the room yet. He's standing outside the door, behind the glass partition, watching the scene unfold with the expression of someone whose understanding of his own place in the world is being forcibly revised at approximately 700 words per minute. The SEAL commander glances toward him with the kind of look that makes grown men understand they've made the wrong calculation. The hospital's attorney makes a small noise that sounds like someone who just realized their professional liability exposure has expanded to include federal law and active military jurisdiction. That's when the security guard arrives, the same one who escorted Hannah out of the building 4 days ago with her belongings in a cardboard box. He walks past Dr. Hargrove without making eye contact and carries a second cardboard box into the ICU. He places it gently in Hargrove's hands with the precision of someone performing a ritual. His voice is quiet enough that only Hargrove can hear it, but quiet enough that somehow everyone understands it anyway. I believe you know the way out. The box is heavier than Hargrove expects. Inside it will be his personal effects from his office, the framed photographs of his credentials, the awards from medical societies, the pen set from the hospital board. Outside, the hallway stretches toward the exit, and at the end of that hallway is the rest of his life, smaller than the one he walked in with. He doesn't move immediately. He stands there, holding the box, while every eye in the room becomes a weight he can feel settling against his spine. The SEAL commander doesn't look away. Hannah Clarke doesn't look away. Mrs. Reeves doesn't look away. Even Marcus Reeves, still pale from blood loss and still attached to machines that breathe for him, manages to turn his head enough to watch Hargrove understand that he's been removed from the equation entirely, not through drama or confrontation but through the simple recognition of authority he never actually possessed. Hargrove walks. The hallway echoes his footsteps. Somewhere in the distance, and for pump beeps its steady rhythm, indifferent to the fall of men. 6 months later, the light inside Oak Creek Memorial's main atrium comes down through glass skylights like benediction, and 200 hospital staff members stand beneath it waiting. The ceremony will be brief. 30 minutes of speeches, 1 medal, and a story that's already transformed from hospital scandal into national legend. The local news arrived early. The Army Times sent a photographer. CNN's Denver bureau decided this was worth a segment on their evening broadcast. In waiting rooms across the city, patients watch their televisions and understand that this hospital is a place where someone actually stands when 12 physicians walk away. Hannah Clarke enters the atrium in dress uniform. Navy service khakis, the color of sand dunes and distant operations, pressed sharp enough to cut. Her ribbons form a constellation across her chest: Navy Cross, Silver Star, Bronze Stars in rows, Purple Hearts, the Foreign Service ribbon, the Combat Action ribbon, and beneath them all, the small deliberate badge of someone who survived things that were designed to be unsurvivable. The crowd parts without being asked. The air pressure changes the way it always does when someone walks through a room carrying the weight of invisible rank. Beside her, Captain Marcus Reeves stands in army dress uniform, his bearing military precise despite the way his left leg still bears the muscle memory of trauma. His dress blues fit him like armor. His medals catch the light. He walks with Hannah to the stage the way soldiers walk, not toward destination but toward purpose. The hospital CEO takes the microphone and speaks about institutional courage and clinical excellence and unwavering commitment to patient care in the face of institutional failure. The words are correct. They're just several magnitudes smaller than what actually happened. But that's how these ceremonies work. You shrink the incomprehensible into something that fits into speeches. Hannah reaches the podium. The CEO hands her the Medal of Valor, a crystal eagle mounted on walnut, the weight of it immediate and real in her hands. She turns it over, and in that moment of turning, something shifts. She reaches into her jacket lining, the place where she's kept a single faded patch for 20 years, the 75th Ranger Regiment insignia she cut from Marcus's uniform in Sangin when he was 6 years old and hemorrhaging, when the only thing her hands could do was hold pressure and pray. She unfolds it. The bloodstains are still visible, rust-colored against tan fabric. She pins it to the display beside the medal, careful, precise, the way a person pins something they've been waiting decades to place. Marcus steps forward. His right hand rises in a salute, crisp and formal, the acknowledgement of one warrior toward another. His fingers form a line parallel to his eyebrow. His elbow stays at 45 degrees. It's a movement rehearsed 1,000 times on parade grounds and in forward operating bases and in the moments before dawn when soldiers understand they might not come home. Hannah returns the salute, and for 5 seconds the atrium contains nothing but the sound of flashbulbs and the hiss of breath held by 200 people who understand they're witnessing something that won't fit into ordinary narrative. Mrs. Reeves weeps in the front row, the tears of a woman who sent her son to war and got him back twice, once from a foreign country and once from an American hospital that nearly killed him. Commander Sutton stands at attention against the back wall, his presence a confirmation of things that can't be classified anymore because they've become too important to hide. The journalist from CNN whispers to her cameraman, "Did you get the patch?" The cameraman nods. That image, Hannah's scarred hands carefully pinning the bloodstained 75th Ranger Regiment patch to the hospital's Medal of Valor, will become the photograph that defines her, the one that runs in newspapers from Denver to Washington, D.C., the one that finally tells the world what she's been carrying all along. That same evening, in a one-bedroom apartment on the north side of Denver, Dr. Hargrove sits on a couch he'll own free and clear in 4 years, having paid for it on an $18 per hour salary, teaching CPR to people who will never remember his name. He sees the ceremony on the local news. He sees the patch. He sees Hannah Clarke wearing her rank like she was born to it, which she was. He sees Marcus Reeves salute her, and he understands, finally, completely, the magnitude of the calculation he made wrong. He reaches for the remote and turns off the television. The screen goes dark. His apartment goes darker. The insomnia will hit in about 45 minutes, like it does every night, and he'll lie awake replaying the moment in that ICU room when he understood he destroyed the wrong career. If you want to see what happens when someone chooses ethics over liability, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value, drop a comment below. And remember, heroes walk among us. Sometimes in scrubs, saving lives in the dark.